Religion dictates that taking a warm bath is a catastrophic moral failure, and smiling at a joke could literally damn your soul. This wasn't a punishment facility. It was a medieval monastery. The holy life was actually a bureaucratic nightmare governed by thousands of hyper-specific laws. Here are the 50 most unhinged, hilariously absurd rules that monks and nuns were forced to survive. 1. The rule of Saint Benedict strictly outlawed any laughter that was considered loud, boisterous, or simply just for fun. According to this cornerstone of monastic life, joking around was a spiritual liability. Monks were expected to maintain a posture of solemn humility at all times, meaning a well-timed pun could literally be viewed as a sinful offense against God. Imagine living with your closest colleagues for 50 years and never being allowed to crack a smile when someone inevitably trips over their own robe. Could you survive a lifetime without ever hearing a good joke? 2. Total silence was often mandatory, but communication was still necessary, which led to the creation of elaborate, highly specific hand signals. If a Cluniac monk wanted a fish for dinner, he would mimic a fishtail wiggling in the water. If he wanted mustard, he had to press his nose to mimic the burning sensation. They essentially invented a medieval version of charades, played in dead silence, just to get through lunch. It turns out that banning speech doesn't stop the gossip. It just makes it entirely gestural and much more passive-aggressive. 3. Taking a warm bath was considered an extravagant luxury and a dangerous temptation of the flesh. Many monastic orders restricted full-body bathing to just 2 or 3 times a year, usually before major holidays like Christmas and Easter. Cleanliness might be next to godliness today, but in medieval monasteries, smelling like a heavily fermented onion was a true badge of spiritual dedication. They believed that denying physical comfort brought them closer to the divine. 4. The job of waking everyone up for the 2 a.m. prayer service came with unbelievably specific safety guidelines. The assigned night watch monk had to carry a lantern and gently illuminate the sleepers. He was strictly forbidden from shaking anyone awake abruptly or making sudden loud noises. The medieval medical consensus was that a sleeping person's soul temporarily left their body, and startling them meant their soul might not have time to snap back into their chest. Alarm clocks would have literally been considered murder weapons. 5. Strict fasting rules forbade the consumption of 4-legged land animals for massive chunks of the calendar. But monks were nothing if not creative loophole finders. Since aquatic animals were totally fine to eat during a fast, the church officially classified the beaver as a fish. Why? Because it spends a lot of time in the water and has a scaly tail. Thanks to this brilliant piece of theological biology, monks could absolutely demolish a massive, roasted beaver on a Friday and still claim they were technically keeping their spiritual diet intact. 6. Going to the bathroom was an anxiety-inducing ordeal involving severe, supernatural oversight. Monks were taught that they were constantly flanked by a personal guardian angel. Because using the medieval latrine was considered a deeply undignified function, a monk had to pull his heavy woolen cowl completely over his head to hide his face. They literally believed that making accidental eye contact with their angel while on the toilet would deeply offend the celestial being. 7. Avoiding the opposite sex was taken to extreme, almost comical levels. If a monk had to leave the monastery for official business, strict rules dictated exactly where his eyes were allowed to point. He was absolutely forbidden from looking at any woman, to the point where some rules required monks to stare firmly at the dirt road ahead of them for the entire journey. Some orders even mandated oversized hoods that acted like horse blinders, destroying their peripheral vision just in case a mildly attractive peasant was farming a field nearby. 8. While lapdogs were banned, cats were grudgingly allowed inside the cloister walls, but strictly as pest control contractors. A monk could keep a cat to protect the precious library from hungry mice, but he was legally forbidden from petting it, playing with it, or treating it like a friend. The feline was officially considered a working tool, no different than a wooden broom or an iron shovel. Giving your mouser a little scratch behind the ears was technically an illegal indulgence in worldly pleasure. 9. Punctuality was not a suggestion. It was enforced with absolute public humiliation. If a monk arrived even a few seconds late to the midnight choir service, or if he accidentally stumbled over the lyrics of a chant, he was not just given a stern look. He was required to instantly throw himself face down onto the cold stone floor of the chapel. He had to remain lying flat on his stomach in total disgrace until the abbot finally gave him a physical signal to stand up. Forget performance anxiety. This was a high-stakes theatrical production every single night. 10. The daily culinary experience was relentlessly bleak, heavily revolving around unseasoned boiled beans, cabbage, and coarse, rock-hard bread. But the real torture wasn't the terrible food itself. It was the strict rule against complaining about it. Uttering a single negative word regarding the watery slop you were served was considered a massive sin of ingratitude. If caught criticizing the kitchen, a monk would be forced to fast on bread and water, which ironically wasn't much of a downgrade from the actual menu. Complaining basically just reduced your portion size. 11. Try sitting in a wooden stall for 6 hours straight. Naturally, you might want to cross your legs to get comfortable. For medieval monks, that was a massive red flag. Crossing your legs was seen as a sign of pride, a lack of discipline, and bizarrely, an invitation for demons to comfortably rest on your knees. Posture was practically a sacrament. Slumping or shifting your weight meant your soul was slacking off. 12. Finding a forgotten coin in your pocket is usually a pleasant surprise, but for a monk, it was a one-way ticket to a horrific afterlife. The vow of poverty was so absolute that claiming ownership of anything, even a spoon, was a severe offense. If a monk died and the abbot found a hidden stash of money in his mattress, he was denied a Christian burial. 13. Silk and soft cotton were strictly reserved for the vain outside world. To constantly remind themselves of earthly suffering, many monks and nuns actively chose to wear undergarments made of woven goat hair. These coarse, scratchy shirts deliberately chafed the skin with every single movement, essentially turning putting on clothes into an act of physical penance. It was a self-imposed 24-hour-a-day itch that you were forbidden to scratch. Imagine wearing a suit made of fiberglass insulation. That was basically high fashion in a medieval cloister. 14. We all drop things in the kitchen, but dropping a clay bowl in a monastery resulted in an incredibly awkward performance art piece. Monastery property belonged to God, so breaking a cheap plate was technically vandalizing holy assets. The clumsy offender had to collect the shattered pieces, carry them into the communal dining hall, and stand frozen in front of their peers holding the garbage while everyone else ate their cabbage in silence. It was the ultimate medieval walk of shame for dropping a soup bowl. 15. The iconic monk haircut, known as the tonsure, was not just a stylistic choice, it was heavily regulated down to the millimeter. Leaving a ring of hair around a completely shaved crown was meant to symbolize the crown of thorns. But if the resident barber got sloppy and your bald spot wasn't perfectly symmetrical, it was a scandal. Bishops would actually conduct surprise inspections with strict measuring standards to ensure nobody was trying to grow out a trendy fringe. Bad hair days simply were not legally permitted. 16. Despite all the grueling restrictions on food, hydration was shockingly generous. Because local water sources were basically biological weapons, monks were allocated an absolutely massive daily ration of ale or wine. We are talking up to a gallon of beer per day, per monk. However, they couldn't just chug it like a fraternity brother. Rules dictated exact methods for holding the cup, taking sips, and absolutely forbidding the loud gulping of alcohol. They were essentially functioning alcoholics with impeccable, deeply religious table manners. 17. Solitude seems like the whole point of joining a monastery, yet you were almost never allowed to be truly alone. When leaving the abbey walls, monks were forced to travel in pairs. This wasn't for physical protection against bandits. It was entirely about mutual surveillance. Your traveling companion was essentially a holy spy, assigned to make sure you didn't wander into a tavern or accidentally look at a woman. It was a lifetime of mandatory adult chaperones where your best friend was legally obligated to snitch on you. 18. Having a beautifully angelic singing voice could actually get a nun in serious trouble. While chanting was a massive part of daily worship, showing off your vocal range was considered a toxic display of personal vanity. If a nun sang slightly louder or more melodically than the rest of the choir to stand out, she was harshly punished for her musical pride. Blending into a wall of monotone sound was the goal. Exceptional talent was viewed as a dangerous gateway to ego. 19. If you were a naturally loud sleeper, you were considered a massive threat to the community. Monks who snored heavily were completely exiled from the main dormitory and forced to sleep in a separate, much colder room. They were essentially treated like noisy outcasts who were actively ruining the holy silence of the night. Imagine being forcefully kicked out of your own bed by your boss just because your sinuses acted up during a freezing medieval winter. 20. Even doing the laundry was transformed into a bizarre, highly choreographed ritual. When it was time to wash their heavy wool habits, the monks marched to the river in absolute silence. They were not allowed to scrub aggressively, splash water, or show any visible signs of frustration with the stubborn stains. The process had to be meditative and perfectly uniform. If you aggressively wrestled with a dirty tunic because it smelled like a wet sheep, you were breaking the peace. Could you do your chores without ever letting out a frustrated sigh? 21. Having a bestie is a basic human need, right? Not in a monastery. Church leaders strictly outlawed particular friendships. The rationale was that if you liked one monk more than the others, you were creating toxic cliques and distracting yourself from God. You had to love all your brothers equally, which basically meant keeping everyone at a polite, emotionally distant arm's length. It turns out enforced universal love often just translates into highly regulated, deeply awkward group socializing. 22. If you wanted to check if you had cabbage stuck in your teeth, you were out of luck. Mirrors were absolutely banned in most cloisters. They were considered the ultimate tool of sinful vanity and a dangerous gateway to self-obsession. Nuns and monks went years, sometimes decades, without ever seeing their own reflection. They simply had to trust that their faces were clean and their hoods were straight. How long could you survive without checking your own reflection in a shiny surface? 23. Surviving a medieval winter in a stone abbey was brutally freezing, but lighting a fire in your cell was totally forbidden. Entire monasteries had exactly one heated room, called the calefactory. Monks were only allowed inside for a few brief minutes a day to thaw their numb fingers so they could hold a quill or a hymnal. Lingering by the fire to get cozy was a punishable offense. If you were caught hoarding a pocket full of warm ashes, your penance was significantly less cozy. 24. Meals were eaten in absolute terrifying silence, save for a single monk assigned to read from scripture. But this wasn't a relaxing audiobook experience. If the reader stumbled over a Latin pronunciation, they had to immediately stop, step down, and perform an act of public penance right there in the dining hall. A simple slip of the tongue meant you ruined lunch for everyone. You couldn't just clear your throat and start over. Your linguistic failure was officially logged as a sin. 25. Monks copied classical texts, but they had to show extreme disrespect to non-Christian authors. To request a pagan book from the library using their silent hand signals, a monk first made the standard gesture for a book, and then he had to furiously scratch at his ear like a dog infested with fleas. This signaled to the librarian that he needed the writings of a filthy, non-believing heathen. Even when they relied on Greek mathematics, they made sure to physically insult the author first. 26. You couldn't even walk across the courtyard however you pleased. Monastic rules strictly regulated a monk's physical gait. Walking too fast was a sign of worldly urgency and spiritual chaos, while walking too slow meant you were lazy and lacking religious zeal. They had to master a perfectly balanced, emotionally neutral, mid-speed glide. Imagine having to consciously police your own walking speed for 50 years, ensuring you never looked too eager for the dinner bell. 27. Receiving a care package from your family back home sounds lovely, but it was a massive administrative nightmare. A monk could never just accept a gift. Every single item sent from the outside world had to be handed directly to the abbot, who would then arbitrarily decide if the monk actually needed it. You could get a warm pair of socks from your own mother, only to watch your least favorite coworker wear them the next day because upper management reassigned your knitwear. 28. Human bodily functions were notoriously disrespectful to the divine schedule. If a monk unexpectedly sneezed or coughed during the middle of a sacred chant, they were treated like they had just committed spiritual sabotage. They were required to immediately drop to the ground and beg for forgiveness from the entire choir for breaking the harmonic rhythm. Do you think you could suppress a violent allergy attack while wearing a dusty wool robe in a candlelit stone chapel? 29. When the horribly bland boiled cabbage simply wasn't awful enough, some hardcore monks decided to take culinary suffering to the next level. To ensure they felt absolutely zero joy while eating, extremely devout brothers would intentionally sprinkle fireplace ashes directly over their daily meals. They essentially used dirt and soot as a reverse seasoning to aggressively kill any lingering flavor. 30. Being helpful could paradoxically get you in deep trouble. Without the abbot's explicit permission, monks were strictly forbidden from lending their assigned tools, books, or writing materials to a brother in need. Since nobody legally owned anything, lending a quill was viewed as presumptuously acting like you were the boss of God's property. They essentially managed to turn the simple, kind act of handing a guy a shovel into a major corporate compliance violation. 31. You might think bedtime would be the one moment of true relaxation, but you would be entirely wrong. Monasteries required their inhabitants to sleep in massive communal dormitories, fully clothed with their belts securely fastened. To make matters worse, a candle was kept burning in the center of the room all night long. The goal was to prevent any secret, sinful behavior under the cover of darkness. They were basically subjected to eternal twilight and heavy wool pajamas. It is a miracle anyone ever got enough sleep to wake up for the 2 a.m. prayers. 32. Making a spelling mistake in the scriptorium wasn't just a simple typo, it was literally a demonic feeding frenzy. Monks were terrified of a highly specific administrative demon named Titivilis. He roamed the writing rooms with an invisible sack, eagerly collecting skipped letters and sloppy handwriting. Every time a monk made an error, Titivilis scooped it up to use as damning legal evidence against him on Judgment Day. A simple misplaced comma could actually cost your eternal salvation. 33. If mice or caterpillars infested the abbey garden, the monks didn't just set traps. They took the pests to actual court. Monasteries occasionally held formal legal trials for agricultural insects. A priest would stand in the field, officially read a legal summons to the bugs, and formally excommunicate the pests from the church if they refused to leave. They genuinely believed that hitting a massive swarm of hungry locusts with a heavy medieval lawsuit would magically solve their devastating agricultural crisis. 34. Medical care for nuns was practically a blind guessing game. Because the rules of bodily modesty were unyieldingly strict, male physicians were completely forbidden from physically touching or examining a sick sister. If a nun fell deathly ill, the doctor often had to stand outside her closed door, loudly asking a proxy about her symptoms. Sometimes, they were only allowed to visually inspect a vial of her urine passed through a tiny window. It was long-distance healing based purely on sheer luck. 35. Your unconscious body was considered a major spiritual liability, so even sleeping positions were aggressively regulated. Rolling onto your back left your heart exposed to nocturnal demonic attacks, while sleeping flat on your stomach was universally condemned as an open invitation to sinful thoughts. Monks were instructed to sleep strictly on their sides. If you naturally tossed and turned, the night watch monk would literally poke you with a large stick until you fixed your unholy posture. 36. If you love highly seasoned food, the cloister would be your absolute culinary nightmare. Spices like black pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg were strictly banned from the kitchen. Monastic authorities genuinely believed that zesty flavors aggressively heated the blood and violently stimulated lustful urges. Therefore, eating a heavily peppered bowl of stew was viewed as a dangerous gateway to physical temptation. Food had to remain profoundly bland just to keep everyone's souls appropriately numb. 37. Even under the cover of thick wool blankets, Your hands were heavily policed. Monks were strictly required to sleep with both hands visibly resting entirely outside of the bed covers, no matter how freezing the dormitory got. This was to ensure nobody was engaging in any sinful, inappropriate touching under the sheets. Your fingers had to practically turn blue from the freezing cold, just to definitively prove to the roaming night watchman that your midnight thoughts were remaining completely pure and entirely celibate. 38. The abbot was basically the absolute monarch of the monastery, and treating him like a normal human was highly illegal. Junior monks were strictly forbidden from making direct eye contact with their superior. Whenever the abbot walked past, you had to bow your head, stare firmly at his shoes, and hold your breath so you didn't accidentally exhale onto his holy aura. Looking your boss in the eye wasn't showing confidence. It was a severely punishable act of aggressive and arrogant insubordination. 39. You could never just casually stroll into a room. Crossing a doorway was a highly choreographed, vocal event. Before entering a fellow monk's cell, you had to stand outside and loudly recite a specific Latin phrase. You then had to stand completely frozen in the hallway until the person inside replied with the correct counter-chant. If you walked in before the verbal password was cleared, you were treated like an aggressive home invader. Monasteries basically ran on a medieval vocal smart lock system. 40. Picking up a piece of fallen fruit could immediately label you a thief. If a monk was walking through the abbey orchard and saw a perfectly ripe apple lying in the dirt, eating it was an unforgivable crime. Plucking unauthorized snacks outside of the highly regulated mealtimes was breaking the strict vow of poverty. You were essentially stealing God's private apple stash. The only acceptable response was to ignore your violently rumbling stomach and politely leave the fresh fruit for the local worms. 41. Getting sick in a monastery wasn't an excuse to complain. It was officially viewed as a divine pop quiz. A monk suffering from a severe fever or a terrible cough was absolutely forbidden from whining about his physical misery. Expressing any kind of vocal discomfort meant you were actively rejecting God's holy purification process. You were expected to embrace your agonizing stomach bug with radiant, unbothered joy. 42. Joining a holy order meant completely severing ties with your biological family. If your parents came to visit the abbey, you were heavily discouraged from showing them any real affection. Hugging your own mother was viewed as an incredibly dangerous relapse into worldly attachments. Monks were trained to treat their visiting blood relatives with the exact same polite, icy detachment they would show to a random traveling merchant. Imagine basically ghosting your own mom just to prove your spiritual focus. 43. Yawning during a deeply boring 4-hour midnight prayer session wasn't just rude, it was considered a physical security breach. Medieval monks genuinely believed that opening your mouth to yawn allowed wandering invisible demons to casually fly right down your throat and possess your soul. To prevent this demonic home invasion, they had to frantically make the sign of the cross over their open mouths every single time they felt tired. It was essentially supernatural pest control for extreme sleep deprivation. 44. Having a bad dream wasn't just scary, it was a highly punishable offense. If a monk woke up terrified from a nightmare, it was automatically assumed that he had secretly entertained demonic thoughts during the day, which openly invited dark forces into his sleep. Instead of receiving comfort, the frightened monk had to publicly confess his bad dream to the abbot and perform strict physical penance. Your own unconscious brain could legally testify against you and get you put on a harsh bread and water diet. 45. Medieval bishops spent an embarrassing amount of their time writing angry letters to convents, demanding that the nuns stop keeping pets. Nuns were notoriously fond of lapdogs, songbirds, and occasionally even small monkeys. Church authorities argued that feeding a fancy little hound was a waste of resources that should go to the poor, and that the barking disrupted the quiet contemplation of the Lord. Despite constant threats of excommunication, the nuns repeatedly ignored these orders. Would you risk eternal damnation just to keep your tiny, misbehaving dog? 46. If you showed up even 1 minute late to the dining hall, you lost your seating privileges entirely. The tardy monk was forced to eat his entire meal, sitting completely alone on the dirty stone floor in the center of the room. To make it worse, he wasn't allowed a table, a proper plate, or even a napkin. He had to consume his watery cabbage soup while the entire community silently stared down at him from their elevated wooden benches. It was basically a daily psychological warfare tactic for poor time management. 47. Having beautiful, unique handwriting seems like a great skill for a scribe, but it was heavily outlawed. Monasteries demanded absolute visual uniformity in their books. If a monk developed a signature flourish or a creative way of looping his letters, he was punished for artistic pride. He had to perfectly mimic the standardized robotic font of the abbey. Your individuality was literally erased from the page. Could you spend 10 hours a day writing without ever leaving your own personal mark? 48. The silent hand gestures used by monks included some incredibly specific and insulting signs for things they despised. If a monk needed to signal that a secular person was approaching, he would aggressively pull at his upper lip to mimic a wildly untamed beard. It was the medieval monastic equivalent of throwing shade. They managed to develop an entire unspoken vocabulary dedicated solely to silently judging people who weren't as holy as they were. Even in total silence, the petty drama was absolutely thriving. 49. You only got a proper, luxurious hot bath when you were literally about to die. If a monk's illness was deemed totally incurable, the rules suddenly flipped, and he was treated to a thorough washing with warm water and sweet-smelling herbs. This wasn't for his personal comfort. It was purely to ensure his corpse would be presentable for the upcoming funeral. Essentially, the only time you felt truly clean and relaxed was when you were a few hours away from meeting your maker. Talk about a grim spa day. All right, we have covered 49 bizarre regulations, and there is only one final rule left. But before we get to number 50, it is time for the final verdict. In our opinion, the award for the most unbelievable rule from today's list goes to officially classifying the beaver as a fish. Do you agree with our verdict? Or perhaps another item deserved this dubious honor? Let us know in the comments. And now, our final entry. 50. The most suffocating rule of all was the vow of stability. Once you walked through the heavy wooden doors of a specific monastery, you were legally bound to that exact piece of real estate for the rest of your natural life. You couldn't transfer to a nicer abbey with better food, and you certainly couldn't take a vacation. You were chained to those specific stone walls and those exact same annoying coworkers until the day you died. It was a literal lifetime sentence to the ultimate inescapable group project. Surviving the cloister meant accepting absolute, terrifying authority over every single breath you took. Would you rather work 80 hours a week at a modern job you absolutely hate, or live completely rent-free in a medieval monastery following these exact rules? If you are suddenly very grateful for your freedom today, hit like and subscribe for more history.